This is our lecture covering Chapter 13 from your textbook on survey research. So the lecture begins with a discussion of the Self-Anchoring Striving Scale, or SASS, developed by Cantrell and colleagues. This is a series of questions regarding happiness, and it was included in the 2005-2006 Gallup World Poll of adults in 132 countries. So the Gallup World Poll is a very large scale survey study that's conducted worldwide, and I think it's associated with the UN, but the idea is that it's cross-cultural, it's cross-national, and there were some questions that were occasionally up for grabs to be included. So surveyors, researchers can submit to potentially have their questions included in that survey, and of course it's a way to get access to a giant sample of people. In this case, the poll results showed that the average happiness score for each country varies much more between countries than they do among groups within the countries. So this simple theme illustrates about how large amounts of data can be efficiently collected using a survey design for an extremely large population inference related to human concepts. So survey research, does not have a lot of the aspects that we typically associate with, again, like the gold standard experimental design, but it does have an ability to be extremely generalizable and to gather very, very large sample sizes due to the convenience of surveys themselves and how they're delivered. So as I said, Cantrell's study is called the SAS or SASS, and it was included in that world poll. And essentially what it showed is that the average happiness score varies across countries than it does within the country, which speaks to a little bit of uniformity of happiness within countries versus a lot of variability within. What it kind of means in some ways is that nationality matters for the concept of happiness, that there seems to be certain aspects of certain cultures, governments, resources, things that are available in those countries or that are not, that influence happiness to a large degree. So why do we consider a survey? As I already mentioned, it allows you access to a much, much larger population in many cases, and survey designs are extremely versatile and efficient, and as I said, very generalizable. Because you're getting such large samples, because you're getting such a big piece of the pie, as it were, from the overall population, you're able to make pretty comfortable generalizable assumptions based upon those findings. There's an example from your book, the National Institute on Aging's Health and Retirement Study. This was in 2017. They surveyed 22,000 Americans aged 50 plus, and they've been doing this since 1992. It's an ongoing survey. And the analysis sort of focused on about 2,000 husband and wife couples who had responded to all of the questions of interest in multiple years. So the research that Chopik and O'Brien did was only looking at people that continuously responded to the survey from 92 up until more recently. And what they found, interestingly enough, was from their results was that the partner's happiness influenced health, even apart from the influence of one's own happiness on their own health. Meaning that whether or not your partner was happy seemed to have a significant influence on your health. Even putting aside for a moment how happy you were in that influence. So there's this idea of the dyad being very important in these relationships, and how we do have sort of a connection to one another in committed relationships where your partner's happiness has some serious impact on you, including your physical health in some ways. So the amount of survey data that's implied by people like Ed Diener and their colleagues that have researched the idea of subjective well-being or happiness. It summarizes findings from 140,000 articles referring to subjective well-being. So, when you really get into survey data, you can get these incredibly large samples, especially if the instrument that you're interested in, the measure you're using, has been utilized throughout lots and lots and lots of studies. So how do we go about constructing a survey? It may seem very simple that you just, figure out what questions you want to ask people and include them in the survey, but there is certainly a science and a technique to it to try and get good data, quality data out of a survey, and certainly to avoid specific confounds. So these are a few ways in which we can maximize the validity and the reliability of our survey questions, and we're going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. So first and foremost, you want to avoid confusing phrasing. You want to make sure that the vast majority of people that are reading that question understand what it is asking. So you want to avoid confusing phrasing. You want to use shorter words and questions. Long, convoluted questions are more difficult to understand, and unfortunately, difficult words may be hard for some people to understand based upon limited vocabulary or education. Sorry, my microphone was dipping there a little bit. As I said, you want to utilize language and sentence structure that's not confusing to people. You want to avoid like long compound sentences with lots of connectors. You want to try and keep them simple and as direct as possible. Another thing to consider is avoiding the use of double negatives. Respondents have a difficult time understanding and interpreting double negatives at times, and so you can end up polluting your data and adding a lot of error. You also want to avoid what are called double-barreled questions. Double-barreled questions essentially present the respondent with a question that they can't really answer accurately, because if they answer if you agree with one of the questions and disagree with another, then you don't know how to answer, because generally speaking you have one response option, right, depending on how you've structured it. So you want to make sure that the question asks one thing and one thing only, and certainly doesn't create a possible environment where the person could be torn between saying, well, it's yes to the first part of the question and no to the second part of the question, so how do I answer that? You can sometimes add filter questions, which we'll talk about a little bit. A filter question is basically an idea that it creates a skip pattern for someone. So if there's a whole subset of questions or a question that doesn't apply depending on how you answer a previous question, you can create what's called a skip pattern or a filter question to tell the person, if you answer yes, then go on to these contingent questions. But if you answer no, then you can skip and jump to number 16 or 25 or whatever it is, whatever the case may be. This is an example of a filter and skip pattern. So are you currently employed is the filter question. If they answered no, please skip to question 16, which is how satisfied are you with your life in general. The question that you skip, if you answer yes, you would then go and complete the contingent question, which is how satisfied are you with your current job. What this means is that, let's say that you didn't have this filter question, skip pattern introduced in place. If someone was not currently employed, they would then be asked to answer a question that does not apply to them, which can really introduce confusion and also can introduce some fatigue in the respondent. You want to make sure that you don't build any stumbling blocks into your survey. You don't want any questions that makes the person go, wait a minute, I can't answer this, I don't know. That frustration can have an impact on the quality of their replies. It can also, in some cases, be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and the person decides to opt out. They say, hey, this doesn't apply to me, and they just kind of skip the rest of the survey, and then you're left with incomplete or absent data from that person. Another issue, of course, is to try and minimize the risk of bias. You want to avoid subtle problems in your phrasing that can create issues. One of the things I think as a culture we're all becoming very aware of is the idea of how gender is more fluid and less binary than we've traditionally thought about it. And so, including questions that include implicit gender stereotypes, that force people into those stereotypical patterns, or that are not inclusive of people that may not identify clearly as one or the other, or may identify as non-gendered or as binary in some way. So the issue is that you run into a problem by introducing bias, and ultimately, besides being respectful of your respondents, what you're doing is potentially introducing error or losing the buy-in from the respondent because they are frustrated by what's introduced in those questions. You also want to, and this is an interesting turn of phrase, you want to excuse me, avoid making either disagreement or agreement disagreeable. So let's walk through that for a moment. Oftentimes there's a human tendency to agree, to avoid appearing disagreeable. Despite the old idioms like the squeaky wheel gets the grease and all that, there is a tendency amongst human beings to go along, to be somewhat agreeable. And so if you introduce a survey question that asks people about, for example, illegal or socially disapproved behaviors, even when you've reassured them of their confidentiality, sometimes people are reluctant to indicate their participation. That doesn't mean you can't study these issues. One of the things you can do is to be very clear and upfront about confidentiality and explain how the person's identity will not be released in association with their particular answers. And so that can help sometimes to make people feel more comfortable. You also want to minimize this by prefacing questions with explanations, or asking about a larger range of behaviors that might not be so specific or so hot button, for example. But oftentimes what you can do is sort of establish, okay, we're going to ask you about some sensitive questions just as a reminder. Your answers are confidential and we encourage you to be as honest as possible, that kind of thing. You can sort of build in some structure to help get good responses from people. Another way to try and write good survey questions, is to minimize these sort of social psychological phenomenon um, like fence sitting and floating, and I'll explain what each of these are. These are two common problems that stem from people's desires to choose an acceptable answer. Fence sitters are neutral individuals who give erratic responses if forced to choose between opposites. So you don't really want to force neutral individuals to choose between options. If they genuinely have a neutral opinion or a neutral response to a question, then give them that option, right? Because otherwise what you're doing is you're kind of forcing people to choose one side or the other when in fact they may be ambivalent or it may be more complicated than either A or B, yes or no. So if it makes sense logically that there is a neutral response to this question, or it's likely or possible to have a neutral response, then create that option in the survey question. Sort of the opposite of that is the idea, well, not the opposite, but a related concept is what are called floaters. And floaters are respondents who choose a substantive answer when they really don't know. So a third of the public will provide an option on a proposed law that they know nothing about if they are asked for their opinion in sort of a closed-ended survey question that does not include don't know as an explicit response choice. This is based on some previous research. So people will try to just, part of that is kind of like faking good, trying to appear more knowledgeable or more opinionated maybe on issues that you feel like you should have an opinion about when you don't, or that you don't know, you haven't bothered to educate yourself. So by not including a don't know option, what you're doing is you're forcing people to commit to one or the other, when in fact they may not have an opinion or have enough information to have formed an opinion yet. So in that situation I mentioned just a moment ago, if you give these people who don't have enough information to answer the question an option of don't know as a response, 90% of them will select that. So what you're doing is you're increasing the validity of your data. You're not having people agree to something they don't truly believe or don't have an opinion about. So you can give individuals a don't know or no opinion option to avoid floating. One of the things you can do basically to try and see whether or not you've written good survey questions is don't structure and build the survey and then immediately utilize it in your primary experiment. What can be really helpful is to sort of do some pre-testing or some piloting of the survey, so you can conduct what's called a survey pre-test as a final checked question wording. This is where you draw a small sample of people from the population that you're interested in, and you give them the survey or something very similar to it, and then you can actually do a debriefing and say, hey, question 16, did you have any issues with that? Did you feel like there were things that were missing on this survey? Did you wish things had been structured differently? Are there aspects of it you found confusing? You can really make sure that you haven't committed some of these errors that we've just described by just getting some feedback on how you've done. All right. So this is that example about, they're using the our government leader SMART example here, but the idea is that if you look at the option here, if you don't give a no opinion option, what you get is this result that seems to think that people are mostly split on this opinion, that there's a slightly more think not smart versus smart. If you give that option of no opinion, you suddenly realize that nearly half the respondents don't have a strong opinion about it, and it changes the ratio of relationship between smart and not smart as actual answers possibly given. So what you're doing is getting more valid data. You're getting a better picture of what's actually going on with people's opinions regarding whatever particular question you're looking at. One issue in survey construction is what's called idiosyncratic variation, and this is where responses vary because participants have a reaction to a particular word or an idea. This is really where you have to delve pretty deeply into the structure and the language choices that you're making, and it can be a problem for certain individual questions. One way you can sort of offset idiosyncratic variation, you can try and control for it essentially, is to create an index out of the participants' responses. And an index is really a sum or an average of multiple questions about a concept. This is kind of related to the idea of utilizing multiple measurement to get at a concept or at a construct. We can operationalize through multiple measurements to get a better picture. And the same is kind of true in this case. there might be some aspects of a particular question on your scale that introduces some error through idiosyncratic variation. But if you utilize an index, what you're doing is you're minimizing the impact of that particular question and getting some sort of larger handle on the concept. The self-anchoring striving scale that we mentioned at the beginning of the chapter is an example of this index. That it's an index that measures happiness. So the person's score on the SASS is not how they responded to one question. It's a summation or a mean of how they responded to all the different questions. And so you can look for consistency, and responses to different questions should be correlated with one another. And there's some examples of looking at other measures of what's called concurrent validity. Remember, you can go and you can look at other measurements of happiness or that kind of thing, and you can look for correlation amongst individual questions, but also the overall index. There's a whole set of special statistics that we utilize called reliability measures. We mentioned some of these before, that help us to decide whether the responses are consistent across the questions asked of a sample. And sometimes by running some reliability analysis on your survey, what you'll find is that you need to throw out certain questions, or maybe you need to consolidate certain questions. Now, in many cases, what we do is we utilize an existing index, right? We don't reinvent the wheel. If I want to measure depression in my sample that I'm studying in one way or another, I don't necessarily need to build my own survey measure that measures depression, excuse me. I could just utilize something like the Beck Depression Inventory or the Patient Health Questionnaire. These are well-established, reliable, and valid measures that have been utilized in tons and tons and tons of studies. And so it allows you to have some confidence, and it allows you to probably avoid some of those errors you might introduce by creating your own measure by utilizing something that's already well established. The other nice thing about that is if it is a well-established measure or index, you can then go and compare it to lots of other studies that obtained data utilizing the same measure. So you have this one-to-one correspondence, which can be really valuable in understanding the significance of your findings in the context of other research. So when we're designing a questionnaire, um, how do we want to go about it? What's the process, right? What's the process of going from I have an idea, I want to utilize a survey to measure something. How do I go about doing that? So the context created by the questionnaire has a major impact on how individual questions are interpreted and even whether or not they'll be answered, because people skip questions even when they're instructed not to. That happens a lot in surveys. So the first and foremost, we're going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail, but this is a list of things we can do when designing our questionnaire. So let's go on to the next slide and start talking about each in detail. So as I said, build on existing instruments is a really helpful thing to do. That's where you take an existing set of questions that measure a key concept you're interested in. You have all this evidence from previous surveys that indicates that these measures, these questionnaires, are reliable and valid. If there's one of those out there, use that instrument, right? Don't create work for yourself and introduce potential error when it's not necessary. There's a really excellent resource called the Handbook of Research Design and Social Measurement by Delbert Miller and Neil Salkind. It's been updated, I believe, since 2002. But what it is just a huge list of all these existing measures organized in various ways, including topic of interest. And it tells you lots of things about, you can go to these studies to look at reliability and validity measurements of these types of questionnaires. So it's a great resource. If you say, I want to study memory, you can go and look at all these existing measurements of memory or attention or whatever it is. As is always the case, a really good literature review at the start of the research project will often provide you with access to these instruments. You'll start reading articles that are, in the same context of what it is you're going to study as part of your lit review, and you may start noticing, oh, a lot of these people are using the patient health questionnaire or the R-bands, for studying neuropsychiatric status, whatever it is. You'll start seeing that same measure utilized frequently, and what you'll notice is this might be sort of the industry standard, the common, denominator for a lot of research in this field, and therefore utilizing it's a good idea, because then you can make comparisons directly to other studies with your study. When you are developing your own questionnaire, it is really important to refine and test the questions before you sort of utilize it for the actual research study. Sometimes we think we're asking what are clear questions, but it doesn't always ensure that people have a consistent understanding of what it is you're asking. So you need that external feedback, and the more of it you can get, the better. And this is obtained through some sort of pre-testing or piloting process like we mentioned in a previous slide. You can also share your questionnaire with other researchers in your field or experts in that area that you're studying. Rather than just bringing it to the subjects, you can go to people that really know this area of study and do some collaborative review with them. And they can say, actually, we've looked at this and this wording tends to create problems, and this is why we prefer to use this word than that word, and it tends to get a more valid response. Well, again, standing on the shoulders of giants, not reinventing the wheel. These are all tried and true techniques in science, right? So it's okay to collaborate with others and to get feedback because someone might have been working on this for decades and have a lot of good information for you. So like I said, you can have a panel of experts, you can have peers review it, you can get guided feedback from a focus group where you create a focus group of your, that looks very much like the target sample, that is from the same population, might be smaller in many cases, but you can bring them in and do a formal focus group and really get lots of feedback on whether or not your questions are clearly understandable and valid in that sense. There's also something called cognitive interviews, and this is where you sort of ask people to describe what they're thinking when they read a question. So what you're trying to get is not just do they understand the language itself, but what are the connotations that are going on internally? What are the interpretations people are likely to make with this particular question or this survey? And then finally, you can utilize a pilot program, a survey pretest, and this is where you take the evaluation out and you test it on a small sample of individuals who is, arguably similar to the one that you're going to draw in the larger actual survey study, and then you review their responses and their reactions to the survey procedure. You can even utilize what's called behavior coding, which is you observe the interview and then you listen to recorded interviews and you code according to very strict rules how people are responding to these questions. Specifically, how often are they having difficulty or seeming confused or asking follow-up questions. And then, of course, you can, as I said, have the questions reviewed by an expert panel. This is the least expensive method, and it identifies the greatest number of problems with questions in most cases. But sometimes you want to go directly to the people that you're going to be surveying or the type of people that you're going to be surveying as well. One thing you can do is to add interpretive questions within the survey itself. This is where you're kind of checking in with the respondent to ask them what they mean by his or her response to a particular question. So there's 5 things you need to consider with interpretive questions. So when you're looking at the review or you're reviewing the survey results, you want to know things like, what do the respondents know? You want to assess their level of awareness of the issue, policy, topic, whatever it is you're surveying them about. And sometimes what you'll do is include that into the survey. You'll ask, can you tell me what you know about the proposed change to the law, that's gone on the docket for the Senate to discuss, in the upcoming session. So you kind of get a baseline and you understand what they already know. You can ask about relevant experiences. This happens all the time in vetting juries. Have you ever been the victim of a violent assault? And sometimes that's a good thing or a bad thing depending on who's asking the question in terms of whether or not they want to include you in the jury. So the example of victims of crime versus non-victims of crime would have an interpretation on questions relating to crime or violence. You want to know how consistent the respondents' attitudes are, and do they connect to some larger ideology or perspective? Basically, what are the person's values and what are they bringing to the table, or their belief systems that may influence how they interpret these questions? You want to ask how the respondents' actions are consistent with their expressed attitudes. The respondents' actual, so an example from Patricia Labaugh did some research back in 1980 that said that respondents' actual purchase of life insurance is a more accurate representation of what they believe about their life insurance needs than anything they say in response to a direct question about whether or not it's important to carry life insurance. Essentially, do they walk the walk versus do they talk the talk? We know that certain areas of survey have a very strong demand characteristic. People want to appear perhaps better than they are in their real life in terms of how they behave or what they think. And so sometimes it's important to kind of not just ask the question, but ask specifically, how often do you do this? How often do you actually engage in this behavior? That has its own problem because, of course, people can underestimate, overestimate, but at least you're trying to tie the question to actual behavior. And then finally, are the respondents' actions consistent with their expressed attitudes? Same issue again. This is repeated, but for a different example. Stronger beliefs are more likely to be translated into action. So, for example, signing a petition versus going to a physical demonstration indicates that the attitudes are stronger for the latter, the group that actually goes and protests. So you want to be careful of things like popular opinion trends that may just be people are giving lip service to but not actually believing it, and therefore not translating into actual action. Another issue you want to consider when designing questionnaires is you want to maintain a consistent focus. The questionnaire should be viewed as an integrated whole. It should not be all over the place. Each and every section, every question should serve a clear purpose related to the study's objective and complements the other sections or questions. You want clarity and consistency, and the problem is if you don't have that, it starts to confuse the respondent. What is this questionnaire getting at? What are you asking me about? Oh my gosh, did I answer those other questions correctly? Because now I'm seeing a question that makes me think that this was looking at something else. Now, sometimes it makes sense to have, you want to have some minor deception built into your survey, especially if you're trying to avoid things like demand characteristics. But essentially, you do want to strive for clarity and focus. A lot of these questionnaires are delivered in what's called a self-report fashion. The individual receives it paper, online, over the phone, whatever, not over the phone, that would be interview, excuse me. But in many cases, it's a self-report structure. So you really want to make sure that people who are reading it and completing it understand what you're talking about, what you're asking about, and it's clear. Even within an interview structure, you also want that because it can be very easy to get off topic and meander, and you want to maintain that consistent focus. And if you have a good measure that's consistent in front of you, it's going to tend to drive the questionnaire in that direction as well. Another issue to consider is translation. So do we want to translate the questionnaire into more than one languages to represent our population of interest? So for example, if I am interested in something and I know that a portion of the population that I'm interested in is primarily Spanish speaking, do I want to have my questionnaire translated into Spanish so that I can cast a wider net, so that I'm getting a better, more accurate representation of the population that I'm interested in? If you do, that's great. But the question is then how do you go about doing it? So translation can be very tricky. So you want to make sure that you are properly translating your questionnaire. We want to make sure that it's reliable, that it conveys the intended meaning of the original text, and that things are not lost in the translation process. You want to make sure that it's fluent for the people who speak that language, that it reads well, makes sense in the target language. Again, in the process of translation, did we introduce any confusion? Are there things that are idiomatic in English that don't make sense within a Spanish version, or need to be altered in some way to have a reliable and consistent understanding in the target audience? You want to make sure that it's appropriate. The style, tone, and function are appropriately transferred. Something as simple as tú versus usted in Spanish, it conveys a very different thing to the listener when they hear that, when they read that. And then keeping in mind that translation adds cost and complexity to a survey design. At the very least, you will need to look at the responses in the English-speaking versus Spanish-speaking group just to make sure there was no differentiation, there was no distinction there, to rule out a possible confound, for example, related to that translation process. And of course, it costs money to hire someone who is bilingual in both languages and who is well trained enough and well versed enough in both languages to accurately translate it, and that can be costly in some cases. The order of the questions in a questionnaire is important, and they can influence how the respondents react to the questionnaire as a whole, whether or not they skip certain questions. First, it's typical in questionnaire design to sort of sort the questions into these broad thematic categories or sections within the questionnaire itself. So if you are asking something about something that's more complex, that has facets to it, you want those facets to all sort of be in blocks together if you can. The first question in a survey is important. It's like the first impression, right? So the idea is that it should be simple, easy to read and understand, and it should basically connect to the overall primary purpose of the survey. It should be emblematic, if you will, of what's going to come after it. So that first question can really have a huge influence on setting the tone for subsequent questions in the questionnaire. The order of questions, just as we talked about this back in our measurement chapter, it can lead to what are called context effects or priming effects when one or more questions influence the responses to subsequent questions. The respondent is affected by a question, and that can then color how they answer subsequent questions. So as I said, prior questions can influence how subsequent questions are comprehended, what beliefs shape certain responses, and whether they're now making comparative judgments about themselves or about what the purpose of the survey is. So the potential for context effects is great, especially when you have two or more questions that concern the same issue or closely related issues. Now, I've already said previously that it is sometimes very useful to have multiple questions addressing the same issue so that you can sort of get an index and you can reduce that error that gets introduced. However, you need to be careful of how those questions relate to one another, and how they may influence subsequent answers to similar questions. One way to do this is to just randomize the order of the questions, right? So you might do something like randomizing the questions in a certain order, but that can sometimes cancel out the effective question order. It also adds complexity and adds difficulty. Now you need to create multiple forms, maybe like a ton. If you're fully randomizing and you have a lot of questions, that factorial starts to multiply very quickly, and the next thing you know, you have 15, 20, 50 forms of your questionnaire. That becomes unwieldy at some point. So the idea is that sometimes we want to randomize question order, but we also want to keep things relatively simple if we can. So we want to assess, first of all, if there's likely to be a context or a priming effect from certain questions, and if there is, then consider randomization. You can sometimes, like I said, by randomizing them, you can cancel out some of these effects. Another thing to utilize is what are called matrix questions, and this can sometimes lessen the impact of context effects in a series of questions about the same topic. So matrix questions are where you have a series of questions that have a common theme, and they all have the same response choices. So you might say, for the next 10 questions, utilize this Likert scale of 1 to 7, and you all are familiar with what a Likert scale is, not at all to very much so or extremely, that kind of thing. And we'll look at an example of that. So this is from Ross's interview schedule on work, family, and sense of control. This is reprinted from your book. If you look here, we've got sort of some individual standalone questions in the past 12 months. How many times have you gone on a diet to lose weight? That has these responses on a Likert scale. What is your weight without shoes on? What is your weight without clothing? Do you currently smoke? And then you get down to this subset here, number 49. These are what are called matrix questions. So how much difficulty you have, ellipses, ... And then you go into each of the questions, and they all have the same response scale here. No difficulty, some difficulty, or a great deal, which is operationalized as 1, 2, and 3 for the purposes of statistical analysis. Rather than repeating yourself over and over and over, you can basically have the stem. This is called the stem here. And then you can have all of the sort of specifics formed as individual questions, 49A, B through G. And now you have this matrix set of questions here that can simplify the process and reduce context or priming effects. This may sound dumb, but one thing you can do is to make the questionnaire attractive. Okay, we know from research that an attractive, and I'll define what I mean by attractive in a moment, but an attractive questionnaire is more likely to be completed. It's less likely to confuse the respondent, the interviewer, if it's an interviewer structure. If you're not the one who created the measure, but you are training someone to carry out this interview, it can help them if it's an attractive questionnaire. It also increases the likelihood that different respondents interpret the same questions in the same way. So what do we mean by making it attractive? Well, the visual design has a lot of subtle effects on how people respond or answer questions. There are a few factors, that universally lead to a quote-unquote attractive questionnaire. The first of all, it does not look cramped. I'm guilty of this within my slides a lot. I apologize. It's just the nature of trying to get all the information across. But as I'm sure you realize, when you're in a class and someone puts up a very busy slide versus a very simple one, very simple bulleted maybe, what you find is that, I'm easily comprehending the simple one. That busy slide is making it a little harder for me to get on board and really get all the information out of it and understand where we're going. So you want your questionnaire to not look cramped. You want it to have plenty of white space, more between questions than within questions. You want the questions to be clear where they are self-contained and where the next question then begins. So creating some space in between those questions, you can do this through all variety of layout and line spacing effects, makes the questionnaire appear more easy to complete, right? It's like, oh, there's just these things. I see these individual things as opposed to a whole sheet of text. You want to make sure that your response choices are distinguished clearly and consistently. We often find that listing them vertically, as that matrix question was, versus horizontally across the page can make it a lot easier for people to understand. It's easier to get lost along one line of text as it is to see like sort of bulleted or lettered or numbered answers in a vertical fashion. And the proper path through the questionnaire for each respondent is identified clearly, especially if you have filter and skip sort of type questions. Many people will utilize arrows, even like colored arrows, ways of explaining. If yes, then go to here and you literally draw the respondent an arrow so they know where they're going. So you can utilize a lot of graphic techniques and layout techniques to make the questionnaire more attractive, not for the virtue of just aesthetics, but for the fact that it means you're more likely to get good responses and therefore good data from the respondents if it's attractive. So once we've constructed a survey, how do we organize it, right? How do we get the information from the respondents? What do we do? There are 5 basic approaches or designs for a survey study: mailed, group administered, phone, in-person, and electronic. These approaches to a survey design really differ from one another in the manner of administration, right? In some of them, there's an interviewer in the room who administers the survey in sort of more of a conversational or interview style, while others are self-report. They're completed by the individual on their own. The questionnaire structure can vary in the level to which the content and order of the questionnaires is fixed in advance by the researchers. So in some cases, there's lots of like, you skip whole sections depending upon a certain answer. The survey might be very short or very long, depending on how the person answers certain questions, certain filter questions. The settings differ significantly. Are you doing it on your phone while you're sitting in traffic, or are you in a quiet laboratory-based, sort of clean, sterile setting? Is it public or private? Are you doing it with a group of people at once, or are you just individually meeting with a researcher? Or are you sitting in a room by yourself completing the survey on a computer? And then, one factor, of course, in all of this is the cost. Some survey methods are far cheaper than others. In-person tends to be the most expensive because, you've got to pay the person and train the person and staff the people that are there doing the interviews. Phone surveys, of course, are becoming less and less common because of people screening calls, but a phone survey is also going to require a live person on the other end, but not so much concern about the setting itself. Then mailed servers, and then finally, because mailing obviously involves postage, and then finally electronic surveys are certainly the least expensive and the easiest to get into the hands of people these days. So let's talk about sort of the classic way we often think of a survey being conducted, which is through a mailed self-administered study. This is where you send the participant a survey in the mail in paper form, and they complete it and they return it back to you. Now, of course, a major problem and a drawback with this is the response rate. You have to send follow-ups to non-respondents, and mailed surveys tend to yield very high numbers of non-respondents. This has gotten worse over time, I think, with sort of the less reliance on the mail in general, utilizing email and online services, but also the idea that we receive a lot of junk mail and things get lost, things get thrown away, things are not recognized as being a survey, and therefore they never get to the respondent. And then, of course, just the idea that I think we tend to look at a paper survey as being more demanding or odious than doing an online survey these days. The point being, when someone does not respond, we cannot just say, well, that's our response rate, because of the possible confound that is introduced. We've discussed this before. This idea that non-respondents may differ in a very important, significant way from those that do respond. There may be something about them psychologically, circumstantially, demographically, characteristically, whatever, that's different than those that choose to respond. And you are essentially removing that data from your study by not following up and trying to get responses from these initial non-respondents. You're introducing error. The cover letter is really essential in trying to get people to complete the survey, and it really sets the tone. It should convince the person that it's important for them to complete this survey. There's an example in your book, Exhibit 13.5. But there's certain procedures that were outlined by Dillman in 2000 that says if you want to do mailed self-administered surveys, these are considered sort of the standard operating procedures that are necessary to try and get a good, reliable and valid response rate. So you send a brief announcement before the survey is mailed. You give people a heads up and say, keep an eye on your mail. You're going to be receiving an envelope that's coming from this address that'll look like this, and inside is going to be a survey that we're asking you to complete. You want to send the survey with a very well-designed cover letter that gives a clear rationale. It should also include a self-addressed stamped envelope, so the person can return it to you without any cost to themselves, because that, of course, is going to reduce the response rate. And then in some cases, you utilize like a small, what's called a token reward. It could be a small amount of money, a gift certificate, a coupon or something. But the idea is that you're showing, hey, we appreciate your time. When the person doesn't initially respond, you want to send a reminder postcard. Actually, you send a reminder postcard to everyone, one in which it thanks people who have responded, and then you're sending it also to non-respondents saying, hey, if you haven't completed it yet, please do so about 2 to 4 weeks after the initial mailing. The idea of the 2 to 4 week window is it's likely still, it may not have been thrown in recycling yet, right? It might still be around. The person might still know where it is. They may remember receiving it. They just haven't filled it out yet. Then you want to send a replacement questionnaire to non-respondents about 6 to 8 weeks after the initial mailing. So this is your second chance to try and get that information from those non-respondents. If you do this, which I would argue is a pretty intense, demanding, and potentially costly procedure in terms of the human hours that are needed to do it and the cost of all this mailing, even if this is the case, you're often going to get about a 70% response rate. That's not 100, that's not 95. You're still got about 30% of people at best, optimally, who are not responding, who may have certain characteristics that you're not getting any data on. So even if you do all of these things, it can be a less than perfect approach these days. Another approach is what's called a group administered survey. This is where you bring people in as a group and they complete it themselves. It's self-report, but you have a sort of a proctor or somebody who's there to hand them out, to answer questions, to collect everything at the end, make sure it all gets to the right place. But this is where you bring in a group of people. You've probably done something like this, in the course of your life, academically or otherwise. But you basically come in as a group, assembled in one place, and then people are handed a survey and asked to complete it. Usually a very high response rate because the people are already there, they're present. Very unlikely someone look at it and go, I'm not going to do this, and throw it back at you, right? That doesn't happen too often. There's enough of you've passed a bar by showing up in the first place. Now there are of course non-respondents that don't come to their scheduled appointment to do so. But the problem is that most populations are hard to sample this way unless they have some unified institutional structure. Students, employees, members of the armed services, they're kind of captive audiences in certain ways, right? And so it's not really real world feasible if you're studying people outside of a particular subgroup or institutionalized subgroup that is easy to capture in some way to get this information. For many years, telephone surveys were sort of the way to go, and this is where you would have the interviewer read the survey over the phone and then record the answers from the respondent. This was kind of the classic example of a survey that most people would think of. It used to utilize what was called a random digit dialer, which was a way of doing random selection. You could say, okay, I'm only interested in people in this area code or in this section of the country, so these area codes, and you can program it to only select those types of area codes. But you end up with business numbers, you end up with fax numbers, you end up with inactive numbers, all those things. And it often says sometimes you're going to need a multiple callback to get somebody to get their response, because depending on when you're doing the calling, some people are not home, depending on their work or other activities or responsibilities. Excuse me. This has gotten worse and worse over the years as a survey approach. The problem being, of course, caller ID have became a thing many years ago, and of course we now have it on our cell phones as well. So the idea is that if the person doesn't recognize your call, or even if they do recognize it and they know that, oh, this person's gonna, they told me they were going to do the survey, this is going to take some time, I don't have time to do that now, they can always screen that call and not answer it. Of course, an increasing number of people use cell phones, which are not geographically limited the way that landlines were. And ultimately, culturally, because of the rise of telemarketers and things like that, we have all become much more accustomed to just saying no or hanging up as soon as we realize what it is. This has only gotten worse with the proliferation of telemarketing over cell phones, especially lately. So it's just become harder and harder to get people do a survey over the phone. And again, every time you don't get someone, you're introducing a potential confound as to why that person is a non-respondent, why they're not picking up, why they're screening, or why you get them on the phone and they say no. They may be distinct from the group of people that say yes, and we have to account for that. So generally, the response rate is lower. It's also lower when you're talking about people in hard to reach sort of populations, single parents, low income individuals, people that may not have a phone. They're just excluded from this type of research. But ultimately, it's just becoming less and less viable over time. In-person interviews have a lot of advantages. The response rate's very high. The person's there, and you can give encouragement. You can say, hey, this is really important to us. We appreciate your time. Could you please finish the questionnaire? That kind of thing. It allows for longer questionnaires that can have more complex questions. So if there's a really complex filter or skip structure, if there is, a matrix, the person can help remind you of the matrix along the way to make sure you're getting answers that are valid. And if the respondents interpret the questions in a way that seems a little off or not the intent of the researcher, you can probe and you can clarify that and say, oh, no, I'm sorry, we're actually not asking about that, we're asking about this. And you can bring them back to focus on what it is you're looking at. So it has a lot of advantages. It also has significant disadvantages. First and foremost is the effect of the interviewer themselves. Having to talk to a human being as opposed to filling out an online survey or a paper survey. There may be certain things people are less inclined to be truthful about when they're talking to another person. They may minimize, they may sort of delete certain things from their responses because of just feeling uncomfortable or wanting to please, that kind of thing. And then, of course, different interviewers can result in different responses from participants based on a number of factors, including everything from their own demographics, their gender, their race, their speaking style, their accent, whatever it is that you're bringing to the table. That can really cause something of a problem. In some cases, the interviewer uses a handheld device, an iPad or a phone or a tablet, and this is called computer-assisted personal interviewing. This is a technique where you may have a laptop or, like I said, a tablet or something that displays the questions and the responses, and the interviewer is the one who's actually typing these in. The great thing about this is that it makes it very difficult to misadminister because you can build in contingencies. You can say, nope, you skipped a question, go back and do that question, or hey, you shouldn't be asking these questions because they said no to the filter question, that kind of thing. It makes it, as I said, very easy to develop those sort of skip patterns. And it also makes it easier in some cases because your data is immediately being entered into a database. As soon as the survey is completed, the person pushes a button on the device and it pulls that data automatically into a spreadsheet or a database of some kind. So it can be really efficient in that manner as well. The other disadvantage, obviously, as we've mentioned, is it's expensive and it's demanding. So it requires people, both respondents and interviewers, it's demanding. It requires people to be in a physical place often to do this. They have to come somewhere to do it, and it requires you to pay and train and maintain a staff. And the more you pay them and the better you train them, the better data you get. So that can be a serious expense of in-person interviews despite all of its advantages. Finally, let's talk about electronic surveys, which is by far the dominant approach these days. They can be email, web-based, they can be built into certain apps, they are flexible, they are cheap. If the population that you are studying is familiar with utilizing computers or cell phones, the response rates can be very, very high. The barrier to participation seems lower to the participants, and therefore they're more likely to complete it. You can have pictures and audio segments that can be added when they're useful. As I said, in this case, sort of like with the computer-assisted interviewing, the answers are recorded directly into the database, so you eliminate a lot of data entry errors. The results can be reported very quickly because it's already right there. You can immediately run analysis on it. So to ensure, and you can also ensure that the person you're getting on the other end is the person they say they are by using a pen or some sort of other way for them to verify their identity to gain access to the questionnaire. So you can make sure that you are in fact talking to the person that you intend to talk to. So let's compare these types of designs a little bit and talk about some of the pros and cons of each. We've already discussed these a little bit, but essentially, when you're comparing the advantages and disadvantages of these 5 methods, the answer to that question is best answered by what data do you need and what are the unique features of the topic and of the target population. And these comparisons yield a general conclusion, which is mailed surveys tend to have the lowest response rate. In-person interviews are the strongest design and generally preferable when you have the resources and the trained staff to do it. And telephone surveys have many of the advantages of an in-person interview at much less cost, but of course the response rate is becoming an increasing problem. As a result of all of these factors, when we can do in-person interviews and we can afford it, that's still preferable as sort of over most other options. But what you're seeing is a lot more electronic surveys, especially as the technology gets more nuanced and people become more and more familiar with that format. So once I have a survey, how am I going to analyze it? Um, One of the most common analyses of a survey is what's called a contingency table. This shows how the responses to one question, the dependent variable in this case we might call it, the outcome, are distributed within the responses to another question, the independent variable, the causal factor that we're positing in this relationship between variables. I'm using the term dependent and independent variable here, as your book does, a little loosely. So this is not a true experiment. This is a survey. There's no manipulation, but we often just use that as a shorthand to understand what we're really talking about is the cause or the factor that we think has an impact on the outcome, which we're going to often refer to just for shorthand as the dependent variable. Even if this hypothesized pattern exists in the contingency table, as is always the case with any kind of scientific findings we discussed thus far, we can't be sure that pattern did not happen to chance alone. So we do have inferential statistics that give us a p-value that tell us whether or not that relationship observed between those two variables is likely due to chance or not. And the most common one is what's called a chi-square test. A chi-square test is chi being, obviously the Latin, I'm sorry, the Greek, excuse me, the Greek symbol that we use. A chi-square test is it's an inferential statistic. It uses it looks at testing hypotheses about a relationship between variables within the contingency table. It's very similar in some ways to something like a t-test, in the sense that it gives us a statistic and then it gives us a p-value, which of course we've talked about is our indication as to how likely it is this connection between these two questions in the contingency table is due to chance alone, which also then implicitly talks about whether or not we think our research hypothesis might have some validity. When we're fairly confident that the relationship did not happen by chance alone, we often refer to that as a statistically significant relationship between those variables, which of course we've talked about as being indicated by that p-value, typically at a value of 0.05 or less, meaning that there's only a 5% chance or less that the observed relationship was due to chance. So let's make a few conclusions very quickly about this type of research. It's exceptionally efficient, it's productive, it can investigate a wide variety of questions, and it can get you a lot of data from a lot of people very quickly and very easily. It doesn't allow for any manipulation of the independent variables per se, so it is in fact it's kind of a subtype of correlational research because we're not manipulating anything. We're just gathering data about certain variables and we're looking at how they're related. So we call survey research often correlational research because it only allows us to determine whether variables are associated with one another. By creating contingency tables, calculating correlation coefficients, and using other statistics like chi-squares, we can talk about relationships between these variables, but we don't really have the level of internal validity we need to make a causal argument. As a result, what happens is oftentimes surveys get us started with our thinking about the relationship between hypothetical constructs. It's a great place to begin to understand those relationships, and then that might inform the design of an actual experiment that we will subsequently pursue to increase that internal validity and the strength of our ability to make a causal argument between the variables. So it is an important tool in your toolkit, but it often is paired with more traditional experimental approaches down the line.